Adrian Holt arrived 11 minutes early to the Sterling Vantage Tower on Bay Street, and the laughter started before the elevator doors had even closed behind him. It came from a cluster of men near the reception desk on the 42nd floor, broad-shouldered, gym-built, dressed in compression gear that made their muscles look sculpted rather than earned. One of them elbowed another and nodded toward Adrian's jacket, a navy windbreaker gone soft and faded at the elbows, the kind of jacket a man wears not because he likes it, but because buying a new one always feels like a luxury he can postpone. Under his arm, he carried a beat-up folder, the corner bent from being shoved into a backpack too many times, and on the inside flap where nobody but him would ever see it, his 8-year-old daughter had drawn a small crooked sun in purple marker the night before, because she said he needed sunshine for luck. He noticed the laughter. He let it pass over him the way rain passes over a roof that's already weathered worse. 23 men stood scattered across the assessment floor that morning, all auditioning for the same 6-month executive protection contract, a job that paid enough to finally get Sophie out of the basement apartment on Gerrard Street and into somewhere with actual sunlight. Former military police, a retired CFL linebacker turned bodyguard, a couple of competitive MMA fighters with sponsorship logos still stitched into their gym bags, and Adrian, who to anyone watching looked like he'd wandered in from the wrong building entirely. What none of them could see, because nobody ever looked that closely at a man who didn't look dangerous, was that Adrian's eyes had already mapped the room in the 11 seconds it took him to cross from the elevator to the registration table. 2 exits. 1 emergency stairwell behind the frosted glass partition. A blind spot in the southeast corner where the security camera's sweep paused for exactly 4 seconds every rotation. A guard near the elevator bank favoring his left ankle, which meant a recent injury, which meant a weakness. He'd spent 11 years learning to read rooms like that. He just didn't tell anyone anymore. Name, the woman at the registration desk asked, not quite meeting his eyes. Adrian Holt, current employer? Independent contractor. Residential maintenance, mostly. That earned a fresh round of laughter from the cluster of applicants behind him, louder this time, deliberate. A tall man stepped out from the group, 6'5" at least, shoulders like he'd been built in a lab specifically to intimidate people in waiting rooms. Brett Colson. Adrian recognized the name from the sign-in sheet a moment later. Colson had fought professionally for 6 years before moving into corporate security, undefeated in 2 regional circuits, the kind of resume that made HR departments weak in the knees. Maintenance? Colson said, grinning at the others. You sure you didn't get lost on your way to fix somebody's furnace? Someone near the back muttered something about checking if Adrian had brought his toolbox, and a ripple of laughter moved through the room. Behind the glass observation wall above the training floor, a few of the Sterling Vantage executives glanced over, amused, already writing Adrian off before he'd thrown a single punch. Only one person on that upper floor wasn't laughing. Isabel Marchetti stood with her arms folded, watching the room with the stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago that stillness made people underestimate her too. She was the CEO of Sterling Vantage, 38 years old, the youngest person to ever run a logistics and freight conglomerate that size in Canada, and she had personally approved one final unscheduled slot in this morning's tryout after a message arrived on her private line 2 days earlier. No return address. No credentials. Just one line. If a man named Adrian Holt walks in, watch his hands before you watch his resume. She hadn't told anyone about it, not even her head of security. Down on the floor, Colson had drifted closer. Close enough that Adrian could smell the protein shake on his breath. You sure you're in the right room, old man? Adrian finally looked up. There was nothing performative in the way he met Colson's stare. No posturing, no chest puffed out, just a flat, even calm that made the air around them feel suddenly colder. Depends, Adrian said quietly. Is this the room where height gets mistaken for skill? The laughter cut off mid-breath. Somewhere behind the crowd, a chair scraped against the floor. Colson's grin sharpened into something closer to a threat. Good, he said, backing toward the sparring mats in the center of the room. Because elimination round starts in 5 minutes, and I requested you specifically. The trainers called the matchups by number, not by name, and Adrian drew Colson on the first round, which was either an accident or, judging by the smirk on the head trainer's face, exactly what Colson had paid for with a few quiet words before the tryout began. The other applicants formed a loose circle around the mat the way people do when they expect a show. Colson rolled his neck, cracked his knuckles loud enough that the sound carried to the observation deck above, and settled into a stance that had clearly been drilled into him by professional coaches for half his life. Adrian didn't bother with a stance at all. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, the way a man stands when he's waiting for a bus he already knows is coming. Colson came in fast, A heavyweight's first step, shoulder dropped for a takedown that would have put most men flat on their backs and ended their morning early. It was the kind of move built to be impressive, built for an audience, built to humiliate. Adrian didn't go backward. He went forward inside the strike, and the room lost track of what happened next, because it happened in under 2 seconds. A hand caught Coulson's wrist mid-extension. The other found his elbow, hips rotated, weight redirected. And 300 pounds of muscle and confidence left the ground, and came down flat on the mat with a sound that echoed off the windows like a dropped piano. Nobody laughed. Coulson lay there for a full second, blinking up at the ceiling, trying to process what his body had just told him before his mind could catch up. Around the mat, 22 grown men who had been smirking 30 seconds earlier stood in absolute silence. And that was the exact moment every alarm in the Sterling Vantage Tower began screaming. Red emergency lighting flooded the training floor. A woman's voice shrieked somewhere above them, cut short. Then a security officer's voice cracked over the building comms, ragged with panic. Breach, executive floor, all units respond. Adrian didn't look at Coulson again. He looked up, straight toward the observation glass where Isabel Marchetti had been standing only moments before. She was gone. The platform was empty. A CEO doesn't disappear from a secure floor in the first 3 seconds of an alarm unless someone moved her, or forced her to move. He was already running before anyone with actual authority told him to stand down. He crossed the mat, stepped over Coulson without a glance, and reached the security door just as 2 real guards collided trying to get it open at the same time. The red light smeared every face into the same shade of panic. Above the glass wall, the executives who'd been watching a recruitment drill 10 seconds earlier were now shouting into their phones. "Stand down, applicant!" One of the floor guards barked, throwing an arm across Adrian's chest. Adrian caught the man's wrist, gently, but firm enough that the guard felt exactly how easily it could be broken if he wanted it to be. "Your camera sweep on this floor has a 4-second blind spot at the southeast corner," Adrian said, his voice flat, almost bored, like he was reading off a weather report instead of standing in the middle of an active security breach. "If whoever did this timed it, they're already past your second checkpoint." The guard hesitated, not because of what Adrian said, but because of how he said it. No fear in it, no adrenaline, just fact. That half-second of hesitation was all Adrian needed. He slipped past, hit the emergency release himself, and pushed into the stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time. By the 8th floor, his breathing was even, but something else had crept back into him. Something he'd spent 6 years burying under packed school lunches, overdue hydro bills, and reading the same bedtime story 4 nights in a row because Sophie liked the part where the dragon turned out to be lonely instead of evil. He hated how easily his body remembered this, how natural it felt to be moving toward danger instead of away from it. On the 10th floor landing, he found a security guard slumped against the wall, radio crushed under his shoulder, breathing shallow. Adrian crouched for exactly 1 second. Pulse, check, injection mark on the neck, fast-acting sedative, professional grade. Nobody walks a corporate tower with that kind of pharmacology unless they planned this for weeks. By the 11th floor, the strangest thing wasn't the silence. It was the camera in the corner of the stairwell, deliberately rotated to face the wall. Someone had built this from the inside. The executive corridor on the top floor was chaos held together by sheer willpower. A receptionist crouched behind the marble desk, silent tears running down her face. 2 junior staffers stood frozen by the elevator bank because nobody had told them whether moving made things better or worse. A phone buzzed uselessly on the carpet, face down. "Where's Isabel Marchetti?" Adrian asked the receptionist. She looked up, recognizing him only as the strange applicant from the floor below, and pointed a shaking hand toward the east boardroom corridor. 2 men, security uniforms. They said it was an evacuation drill. Adrian was already moving before she finished the sentence. He found them at the corner near the boardroom. 2 men in uniforms that were close enough to Sterling Vantage's actual security gear to pass a glance, but wrong in the small ways that mattered. Too much weight forward on their stance. Military training but rushed, improvised. One of them had a hand drifting near his hip, where a holster shouldn't have been visible under a corporate security blazer. Isabel stood 3 feet away from them, chin raised, refusing to look afraid even while she was effectively cornered. "Take your hand off that door," she was saying, in a voice that didn't waver even though her knuckles were white where they gripped the strap of her bag. Adrian used the reflection in a glass award case to angle his approach without giving away his silhouette. One of the fake guards noticed him a fraction of a second too late. Adrian closed the distance in total silence, caught the nearer man by the collar and wrist, and drove him into the wall hard enough to knock the air clean out of his lungs, before the second man's hand finished reaching for his weapon. Down, Adrian said to Isabel, and she dropped without arguing, good instincts, while Adrian drove an elbow into the second attacker's throat, ripped the weapon free of his grip, and pinned him face first against the glass. The first man tried to recover. Adrian caught him once under the jaw, and both men went still on the floor within seconds of each other. Isabel rose slowly, her hair loosened from its earlier precision, looking at the two unconscious men and then at Adrian with an expression that wasn't gratitude. It was calculation, sharp and fast. "Who exactly are you?" Adrian checked the corridor behind her before he answered. "Right now, I'm the only person in this building who noticed your evacuation team was wearing the wrong boots." She looked down. He was right. Sterling Vantage Security wore matte black tactical boots, standard issue. These men wore commercial hiking boots, the kind sold at a sporting goods store, the kind nobody bothers checking because who looks at footwear during a crisis? What followed over the next 2 hours unspooled the way these things always do once the first domino falls. Fast, then slower, then unbearably slow as the truth gets dragged into the light one piece at a time. The internal investigation led by Isabel's head of security, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya. No, not Priya. The file said her name was Naomi Beck. Uncovered that the breach hadn't been external at all. It had originated from an inside Sterling Vantage's own executive ranks. Desmond Hale, the company's longtime CFO, a man who had stood at Isabel's right hand for 9 years and signed off on every major acquisition the company had made, had quietly been siphoning funds through a network of shell logistics companies for the better part of 3 years. The breach wasn't a robbery. It was supposed to be a removal. Isabel Marchetti taken off the board permanently before the quarterly audit exposed the trail. What nobody in that boardroom knew, except Adrian, standing quietly near the back with an ice pack against his shoulder where one of the fake guards had gotten a lucky hit in, was that the name Desmond Hale wasn't unfamiliar to him. It had appeared once before, 6 years earlier, in a stack of documents he'd never been allowed to fully see, attached to an insurance claim that closed with more questions than answers, attached to the worst night of his life. His wife's name had been Claire. No. Adrian had buried the temptation to even let himself think her name carelessly a long time ago, the way you learn to step around a hole in the floor of your own house without looking at it directly. Her name was Nora Holt. She had worked as a compliance auditor on a federal logistics contract years before, the kind of unglamorous government job that involved reading freight manifests and shipping ledgers until her eyes ached, looking for numbers that didn't match other numbers. 3 weeks before the convoy she'd been traveling with was hit on a supply route overseas, official cause listed as insurgent activity unconfirmed, she had flagged an irregularity in a logistics subcontractor's shell transfers, a company that at the time hadn't yet rebranded itself as a subsidiary of what would later become Sterling Vantage. Adrian had spent 6 years telling himself her death was an accident of geography and bad timing, a war zone, a convoy. Statistics that happened to people who did dangerous, thankless work far from home. He had never let himself consider that it might have been arranged. Hale didn't go quietly. Cornered in the parking structure 3 levels below the tower as Naomi's team closed in with 2 armed officers, he tried first to talk his way out, then to bargain, his composure slipping with every step Adrian took toward him. "You think she survives this?" Hale said, backing toward his car, eyes darting between exits, distances, the math of escape running visibly behind his expression. "Investors will eat her alive by morning over this story alone." "Maybe," Adrian said, taking one slow step forward, his voice still that same unsettling calm. "But murder tends to look bad in quarterly reports." Hale's hand moved toward his coat. Before the motion finished, Isabel's voice cut through the parking structure from behind a concrete pillar. "Don't!" She emerged with Naomi and 2 officers flanking her, heels sharp against the concrete, face pale but steady. Hale froze, and slowly his hand came back out of his coat. Not with a weapon, but with a thin manila envelope. He almost smiled. "Before you arrest me," he said, "you should know who actually sent him here." He tossed the envelope toward Isabel. Inside was the handwritten note that had arrived on her private line 2 days before. On the back in different ink, a single name had been added, Nora Holt. Adrian went still before Isabel even spoke. Naomi pulled the rest of the contents free. An archived email recovered from a legal hold that had sat untouched for years. The kind of document that only surfaces when someone with very specific access goes looking for it. It confirmed what Hale's shell company structure had buried. Nora Holt, compliance auditor, had flagged irregular transfers under a sealed review code 3 weeks before her convoy was redirected onto a route it had no operational reason to take. "She found too much," Hale said, bitterness finally cracking through his composure. "And then a tragic accident became very useful paperwork." Adrian didn't move for several seconds because grief that's had 6 years to settle doesn't explode back to the surface all at once. It arrives the way water finds a crack in a foundation. Quiet, patient, returning exactly to the place you'd spent years carefully building a wall around. Isabel watched him and understood in that moment that the man who had appeared out of nowhere at her tryout that morning had unknowingly walked straight back into the exact corruption that had taken his wife from him years earlier. Hale saw the pause and used it. He lunged sideways toward the exit ramp, made it almost 10 feet before Naomi's officers brought him down hard against the concrete. The sound of handcuffs closing was quieter than the alarms had been, but it ended the morning more completely than anything else could have. By the time the statements were finished and the ambulances had cleared out, it was well past noon. Adrian sat in the now empty executive lobby while a paramedic finished wrapping his shoulder, the adrenaline finally draining out of him and leaving behind the dull, familiar ache of a body that had given more than it had left to give. Isabel stood near the floor-to-soiling windows, watching the city move on below as if nothing had happened, the late autumn light catching the edge of the glass. "You saved my company today," she said without turning around, "and possibly my life." Adrian shook his head slightly. "No. I just stopped one man from finishing something he'd already started a long time ago." "And what happens now?" she asked. Before he could answer, the lobby doors opened, and a small voice cut through the quiet like sunlight through fog. "Dad!" Sophie ran across the marble floor in her school sweater, backpack bouncing against her shoulders, the same purple marker folder tucked under one arm. Naomi had quietly arranged for someone to bring her once the building was cleared, understanding in the way only another parent could that some things mattered more than protocol. Sophie skidded to a stop only when she saw the bandage on his shoulder, her face falling. "You said you were just doing a tryout," she said, half accusing, half terrified. Adrian smiled, the first real smile of the entire day, and knelt despite the protest in his shoulder. "Turns out," he said, "tough guys should probably sit down a little sooner than they think." Sophie hugged him carefully, mindful of the bandage in a way that made his chest ache more than the injury did, then turned and studied Isabel with the particular seriousness only an 8-year-old can manage. "Did he get the job?" Isabel crouched down to her height, something softening in her expression that hadn't been there all morning. "Only if he says yes." Sophie considered this for a long moment, looking between the two adults like she was finalizing terms they'd both been too slow to settle on their own, then gave a single, decisive nod as if the matter were now closed. Outside, the early afternoon light spread wide across the glass face of the Sterling Vantage Tower, and for the first time since he'd stepped off that elevator that morning, Adrian felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not the old instinct for danger that had carried him through the last 6 hours. Something quieter. The sense that maybe protecting a future didn't have to mean running from the one he'd already lost. That maybe for the first time in a long while he could stop bracing for the next bad thing and just let this one good thing be exactly what it looked like.